Demanding democracy through destruction. Protesters in Hong Kong turn to vandalism. Will this be used to justify a crackdown from China? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the storming of Hong Kong's parliament. In a matter of minutes, a march in support of Hong Kong's democracy turned the city's parliament, as one official put it, into a crime scene. The doors of the Legislative Council building were rammed open and the main chamber was filled with a sea of yellow hats. But let's be clear, those who ransacked the building did not necessarily represent the hundreds of thousands of peaceful demonstrators outside. Whether or not China sees it that way is not for certain. It's called for a zero-tolerance policy, and many wonder where that now leaves Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. In a moment, we'll hear from current and former members of Hong Kong's parliament. But first, Abu Bakr Shamahi has this report.
Protesters forced their way into a building that's supposed to represent the people of Hong Kong. But for the millions who voiced their anger over the past few weeks, it's a symbol of China's increasing control over their semi-autonomous territory. Around 1,000 protesters broke off from Monday's main protest march of around 500,000 people and smashed their way into the Hong Kong legislature. Police didn't try to stop them.
We want to make government to not try to avoid our voice again, because we are the future of the Hong Kong citizens and we have to fight for our future freedom.
Protests swelled in June in opposition to a proposed law that would allow suspects to be extradited to China. It's since been withdrawn by the government. But the protests have morphed into general opposition to China's increasing grip on Hong Kong, and the sense that Beijing is undermining the freedoms promised before the handover. This is the image of Hong Kong that China wants to project. An indivisible part of China, celebrating the July 1st anniversary of its return from British rule in 1997, and back to its rightful owner, Beijing. But across town at the Legislative Council, protesters were raising a different flag, the old colonial one, and a banner that's blamed the government, rather than the protesters, for the violence. Many say they've been forced into this action, and that vandalizing the chamber was the only way to get their message out. But hours later, once the protesters had been cleared by police, Hong Kong's leader took the opportunity to blame the demonstrators.
The sudden scene that we have seen, which really saddens a lot of people and shocks a lot of people, is the extreme use of violence. If the cause of the social tensions that we have seen is a bill to amend the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance, on the 15th of June, I have announced the suspension of the bill.
Monday's protest was one of the most destructive Hong Kong has seen in decades. Protesters covered their faces, afraid of retribution. And police are now treating the Legislative Council building as a crime scene. But have the protesters done more harm than good to their cause?
I think Hong Kong should be a place where more peaceful and sensible protests take place, not violent clashes, damaging the Legislative Council building. I think those protesters went too far.
But even members of the pro-democracy movement who didn't take part in the violence blamed the authorities.
The biggest worry is, of course, Hong Kong people's safety, because these are critical times. If the government continues to choose not to solve this political problem and chooses instead to use police or even Beijing to deal with Hong Kong people, then we may be facing the biggest tragedy in the 20 years since the handover.
The Chinese government has accused protesters of trampling on the rule of law. Will this violence be the perfect excuse for a crackdown? Or a day that symbolized the power of the people in Hong Kong? Abu Bakr al-Shamahi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Legislative Councilman Michael Tien. He's been a member of several pro-Beijing political parties in Hong Kong. He quit to start his own conservative party called Roundtable. He's also one of Hong Kong's representatives in China's National People's Congress. Good to have you on the program, sir. Do you believe that some of the protesters, at least, crossed a line by storming and vandalizing the legislature?
Absolutely. I think there are two groups of people last night. A smaller group is the one who are very skillful, know how to break heavy glass windows, pry open roller shutters to allow the rest of the people in, and then they subsequently disappear. Then the rest of the youngsters that followed in, I believe, are very zealous youth with a passion, trying to express their frustration on how their voices have not been heard by government, nor have LegCo been able to look after their interests and address their concern. That's why they picked LegCo.
I see. Would you accept then that just because a bunch of anarchists managed to breach a barrier and cause some chaos, that doesn't take away from the fact that a lot of these young people have very legitimate concerns?
Any action violating the law needs to be followed up and, if required, prosecuted. Otherwise, we are sending a very, very bad signal to the whole world and to our younger generation, is that the rule of law in Hong Kong has gone astray. On the other hand, we need to also understand what exactly are behind the frustration of these young people whom, when they enter the building, realize that they may get arrested, thrown into jail, and they still risk it. What is it that gave them this, how should I say it, determination to challenge the establishment? It is something that we need to find out. It's a conflict of a much higher order. And I believe, as I mentioned, their loss of trust in the government and in LegCo for representing them under the one country, two system, the fact that it seems to be, to them at least, the impression is leaning more towards one country than two system, and somehow they worry that the balance will be increasingly tipped.
They worry that the balance will be tipped because of the proposed extradition law, which has been put on the back burner for now. Isn't it a good idea to just scrap it? Because we've seen all the trouble. Even suspending it has not been enough for the majority of Hong Kong's people, because the numbers on the streets were massive.
Absolutely. This extradition bill, with government continue to push it through LegCo amidst massive turnout in the number of protesters on the first Sunday, I think it's a trigger point of people increasingly believing that one country, two system and a high degree of autonomy is eroding. However, they are now asking for a complete retraction of the bill. I have said openly, a retraction of the bill is meaningless, because even the current chief executive, Carrie Lam, can bring it back any time during the last 2-3 years of her tenure. What is more important to me is government's pledge that if and when they ever bring it back, it will be involving a proposal that has mainstream public support. Because I also feel that both the government and the Central People's Government, who came out in support of Hong Kong as our government, in their original direction, is to put a stop to Hong Kong continue to be a haven for criminals committing offenses overseas and then coming back to Hong Kong and get away scot-free. Even in the 1997 early records of LegCo meetings, even the pan-Democrats have stated that they are in support of looking into how to make mutually acceptable arrangement
Understood.
along this line.
But for many of the protesters, and this is a very educated public, this is one of the successes of Hong Kong, they know that a proposed bill or a law is never going to say we're going to send dissidents to China to disappear forever. That might happen folded in under a different law which says we want to fight crime and we want to fight human trafficking and we want to fight bad guys. And by the way, an added bonus is if Beijing requests somebody who's a political dissident, they can be sent over under that law. Don't you understand that from the perspective of the protesters?
I do not believe that that represents the majority view of those who went on the marches.
What is
I
their
believe
view?
the majority went on the march because the government keep pushing for a bill that has not been reasonable, with Taiwan already saying that they do not want to accept this fugitive, of Hong Kong people expressing their worry about the judicial system in China, and government refuses my proposal, which is to have Hong Kong court trying Hong Kong permanent residents committing offenses overseas to try them locally,
Yes.
which has met with very high popular acceptance, and government has turned all these proposals down. So they are furious as to why they push forward a bill that has no sound basis, more than them worrying that themselves be extradited to the mainland for actions that they take in Hong Kong. Everybody knows it's an extradition agreement. It's not cross-border arrest.
Understood. I'm intrigued to try to understand if there's any pressure from the Chinese right now, especially individually. You would have spoken to people in Beijing. It's a crisis. Even though if we watch Chinese state-run media to the rest of the world, they're just celebrating 22 years of the handover. You wouldn't even know something's happening in Hong Kong. But digging a little deeper, some state-run media saying there should be zero tolerance. We've heard the liaison office say the situation is totally intolerable. You're an important man and you have the ear of important people, and people on the mainland will undoubtedly be speaking to you. Are they putting pressure on people such as yourself for the administration in Hong Kong to crack down mercilessly on the protesters?
The answer is a categorical no. Who called a stop to this bill? Is it really Carrie Lam, who destroyed her old self, having declared at 11 p.m. on the first Sunday that she would go ahead? I don't think so. I think the central government has a huge role to play in calling off this bill. So let the facts speak for itself. The central government is a people's government. They can crack down on political dissent, they can crack down on corruption, but when they go against the people, they are very, very careful and they are very rational. A few thousand are minority, mobsters, people with their own self-interest, yes, they would have no mercy, but not common, normal, middle-class, grassroots, families bring their kids peacefully marching on the street who pick up litter during the whole march and rally.
How much would Beijing want to just intervene?
Okay, so my point is that
certainly, how much?
My point is that
okay,
they call off this because they realize.
Go ahead.
They called this off when they realized that they have been misinformed about the degree of opposition of Hong Kong people against this bill.
What should Carrie Lam do now?
What should Carrie Lam do? Well, without question, two things that she must do. She is completely crippled in terms of introducing any politically sensitive, controversial bill in her remaining the years of her term. Secondly, the one thing she must make all her effort in is connecting with the youth of Hong Kong. I have openly pleaded today for her to use the long summer to hold a series of large-scale, closed-door, not in front of the media, closed-door town hall meetings, just listening sessions. Listening to young people, listening to the common people, what is it that they are concerned about in terms of their current frustration and the future direction of Hong Kong. And hopefully, when she has heard enough individual comments, okay, which obviously has to be carefully, how should I say it, organized to prevent any kind of mishap during these listening sessions, so that they can piece together and crystallize 2 or 3 or 4 major concerns of the citizens at large in Hong Kong about one country, two system, where we are now, and then what is it that they want to see in the longer term. Is constitutional reform a key part of their concern? Because that would give them a say in who becomes chief executive, and also the legislature in terms of impartially representing all views and playing its monitoring role, providing check and balance against the government.
Michael Chien, really good to have you on the Newsmakers. I thank you for taking the time. Well, let's broaden out the discussion now. Edward Chin was a leader of Hong Kong's Occupy Central movement and is now the convener of 2047 HK Monitor, a group that says it's striving for true democracy. And Emily Lau is a former member of Hong Kong's Legislative Council and used to be chairwoman of the Democratic Party. Good to have you both on the program. Emily Lau, are you surprised that things took such a turn to such levels of violence?
Well, I don't know. I guess these young people, they feel very desperate and very disillusioned and very angry. And of course, I never support violence, but I hope the international community would understand their sense of frustration. And of course, I call on Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, to come out and respond to all these demands. Demands not just made by the young people, but by many other Hong Kong people.
Edward, do you believe that Carrie Lam has not been listening?
I don't think she is listening much. And to be honest, I'm with the business community. And, you know, they turned this extradition bill into something that's totally out of proportion. I don't know what, you know, like it's like turning Hong Kong into a platform where everyone is trying to calculate what Beijing wants to do. Is there something even behind a much, you know, like some sort of a conspiracy? Now, to answer your question, I think the kids, you know, and I do talk to some of them. They are like the teenagers to maybe university age. They feel very desperate. They don't think the government is listening. So if push comes to shove, they just want to give it all. And some of them are even suicidal. So I think the government needs to address this seriously.
Emily, by storming the legislature, have they harmed their chances at being heard?
Well, I hope not. And I have been trying to tell the international community and urge them to understand the sentiment of these youngsters, and also to understand that the vast majority of the Hong Kong people are protesters, but they are peaceful and orderly protesters. And our demands are very reasonable. So I certainly hope Beijing will not have a harsh crackdown on Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong. It's not Tiananmen Square. And I certainly hope Carrie Lam will come out and engage the public in discussion.
Emily, Chinese state media is calling for zero tolerance. Does that worry you?
Well, of course, it's very bad. I just received a message from the president of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And he knows his students very well. And he's calling for calm and saying that we should come out and engage, talk to each other directly, and not just keep repeating statements and not just going to see, oh, where people should be arrested and charged. And I hope the presidents of other Hong Kong universities will look at what this president has said and also come out and counsel the government to be more sympathetic and understanding.
Is the government going to be sympathetic and understanding, Edward?
I really can't tell, but definitely I think this is beyond the extradition bill, and I think only Carrie Lam, if she is brave enough to tell the international community, is there a bigger conspiracy behind this? Because I honestly think that this has nothing to do with the murder case. And then the students and also some adults as well, they are being pushed to the corner. Now, a lot of money, they have already left Hong Kong and moved their assets, liquid assets, to Singapore. And why is that? You know, there's the one country, two systems is not intact because of this evil bill that she tries to implement together with her cabinet. So this is something quite serious. And then we have to calm the storm. But most important thing is she has to be very honest to Hong Kong people and also to the international community. Why does she create all this mess? Is it herself, just herself, or is there a bigger scheme, a bigger conspiracy behind?
When you say that, Edward,
you know, like hosting a press conference.
Certainly, Edward, when you say a bigger scheme and you're asking questions of about whether this is just herself, are you suggesting maybe that this was a manufactured crisis in order to bring about a Chinese crackdown? Help me understand fully what you're saying.
I take a look at what happened 30 years ago. We had the Tiananmen crackdown. 60 years ago, we had the Tibetan uprising. Now, I don't think Beijing would seriously give us 50 years of so-called one country, two systems. And then they try to use whatever excuse it is. And then we have seen, you know, from 5 years ago during the umbrella movement, at first, what people were asking for was the Deng Xiaoping model, which is you could still criticize Beijing, you could still criticize the CCP, you know, they call, you could still have a horse racing and then you could still have dancing, right? But then now, 5 years after the umbrella movement, they are creating this one evil bill, which is if landing Hong Kong is equal to like landing China. Of course, they are putting it to a halt, meaning a pause, and it's like playing a DVD player. They can replay the thing again. So it's like watching a horror movie, like Aliens. The creature can just come out again and attack everyone. And that includes the business community.
Emily Lau, do you share those sentiments that there's something deeper at play here where perhaps Beijing is itching for a confrontation in order to do something about it?
Well, I don't know. I don't have the evidence. What I have been saying for quite some time is that Carrie Lam made this big blunder because of the Taiwan homicide case, and she wanted to solve it. And she also thought it would be convenient to solve the problem of rendition, which Hong Kong has been negotiating with the mainland for 20-odd years and got nowhere. So she thought she was very clever, and she came up with this. And of course, it's blown up in her face. So what about the other things? I don't know. Maybe it's true, but we respect the rule of law. So if there's evidence, let's hear it.
Yeah, so Edward, if Carrie Lam decides to eject the DVD, it's not on pause. She scraps the bill completely. She takes the DVD out, she breaks it, she throws it away. Have we reached a point where people will accept that and go home? Or have we reached the point of no return?
Well, I hope she would use the word like a retract from the bill, and she hasn't. And right now, is she like a buying time, or is it that she has received the blessing from Beijing? She still got 3 more years to go. That's something we don't know. What I know is like at the 4 a.m. Hong Kong time, she hosts this press conference. Now, is it also like just to follow the what I call UK, like evening news, and then broadcast to the US as well. Just to capture the prime time, morning and evening news. I don't know, but if like she is honest and if she is upfront to Hong Kong people and to the international community, I wish she could do some sort of like a town hall meeting, talk with the business community, talk with the students. And she is playing more like a Beijing person now. Just, like keep her ears, like eyes blind, ears shut. So this is not good.
Right. And we heard the same from Michael Tian, who's close to her, suggesting the same thing, having a listening period where Carrie Lam can listen to the people. Let me ask you, Emily Lau, over the years, in 22 years, is this the biggest test of Hong Kong's autonomy and the biggest test of one country, two systems?
You mean what happened to it in the last 22 years?
Is this the biggest test that we've seen over the past 22 years?
Yeah, it is a big test. And of course, the attempt to pass the Article 23 legislation on national security in 2003 was also a big test. And so it is very bad. But of course, this time we have 1 to 2 million people marching, which is, of course, tremendous. And so I certainly hope it will wake everybody up. So we should always be vigilant about safeguarding our rights. And we hope that the Hong Kong government and Beijing will listen carefully and not to try to erode our freedoms and personal safety.
Edward Chin, do you want Carrie Lam to resign?
I personally do, because like if you work in a proprietary trading firm or an investment bank, if a CEO of a company is underperformed, and this is really underperforming because it scared the heck out of a lot of people, from all sectors, from all social background. We definitely want her resignation. And if you were in the business world, then she would be fired like a long time ago, 2 weeks ago.
Very finally, Emily Lau, do you want the same? You want Carrie Lam to step down?
Yeah, of course. Although some people will say, what's the point? If she's gone, then Beijing will pick another puppet. But I think the message must go out. If someone makes such a huge blunder, the person has to go.
Okay, it's been great to talk to both of you. I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers, Edward Chin and Emily Lau. A group of legislators across Southeast Asia have blasted Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte for destroying his country's rule of law. In a new report, ASEAN parliamentarians for human rights accused Duterte of using trumped-up criminal charges to either detain or intimidate his political opponents. Among the most prominent of them is human rights activist and Senator Leila de Lima. She was a leading critic of Duterte's drug war until she was arrested in 2017 on drug charges. Since then, she's been detained in a cell. Well, let's go to our guest in Manila. RJ Nieto was an advisor to President Rodrigo Duterte's government and is now a blogger and radio host. And Tom Villarin is a Filipino congressman and a member of the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. Gentlemen, good to have you on the Newsmakers. RJ Nieto, so your president saying, if you try to impeach me, I will jail you. He's not just talking to anybody, he's talking to opposition congressmen, senators. That's not very democratic of him, is it?
Well, first, I would like to clarify that I am not an advisor to the government. I sometimes give them my input, my ideas, but I am in no way a formal employee or in any form of contract with the government. Now, as to your question on whether, on what I can say about the president's latest comments that he will imprison anyone who will attempt to impeach him, I actually criticized the president that that is a very unnecessary statement. We all know that my president, President Rodrigo Duterte, is prone to unleashing hyperboles. And so far as I know, he has managed to imprison or at least detain only one political opponent, and that is Senator Leila de Lima. So in as far as keeping true to his quote-unquote promises of sending people to jail, I think that's more of an exaggeration than an actual threat.
Okay, but if we look at his track record, Leila de Lima was outspoken. She was his biggest critic. She wanted to impeach him.
Yes.
And the senator finds herself in jail on drug charges, which human rights groups say are trumped up. Convenient. Might that just be the start? We have evidence that he's done this before.
Well, I think this is the issue with Senator Leila de Lima is very interesting because for several months, the upper and lower houses of Congress held hearings inquiring about the supposed proliferation of illegal drugs in our prisons because early in 2016, or means late 2016 and in early 2017, there's been Senate hearings and congressional hearings checking on whether there really is a shabu laboratory or meth laboratory inside Bilibid prison, which is basically our national penitentiary. Now, a lot of the resource speakers or witnesses, some of whom were prisoners who are incarcerated inside Bilibid, testified against Senator Leila de Lima, accusing her of complicity with the drug trade. Now, in about October 2016, there were two cases filed by two separate groups alleging that de Lima is in conspiracy with other former government officials in the Bilibid drug trade. Now, instead of Senator de Lima answering those allegations, what she did was to totally ignore them, and then request the regional trial court to quash the information.
You believe her imprisonment is justified and has nothing to do with the fact that she went after the president. He threatened to throw her in jail, and you believe the two have nothing to do with each other?
Well, here's the thing. When she appealed to the Supreme Court questioning the justification behind her arrest, the Supreme Court, and she questioned how the prosecutors and the regional trial courts decided that there's probable cause behind her arrest warrant. The Supreme Court itself said that the only information available to them was the evidence, the testimonies provided by the prosecution, because Leila de Lima herself neglected to speak, to defend herself. So what would you have the courts do?
Okay, let's park her off for a moment. Tom Villarin, when President Duterte says, if you're going to come after me and you want to impeach me, whether you disagree with me over the China issue or other things, I'm going to throw you in jail. What's the message to Filipino congressmen?
Yes, sure.
Yes, I think that threatening note coming from the president is gives that air of stifling the opposition, and he has done that in the past. And even now, the chief PNP has abided by such pronouncement of the president, even saying that the PNP, the National Police, will do what the president commands. So meaning, right now, these threats are not empty threats, but these are real threats targeted at the opposition.
RJ, when we hear the president say these things, now, no matter where you stand on the China issue, he might actually be right on the China issue. I mean, this is open to debate, right? So he's siding with China on this particular issue of sovereignty. You have people pushing back against him. That issue can be debated on its own merits, but the fact that this was his first knee-jerk reaction to any criticism, doesn't it tell you that you have a president who has absolute contempt for the democratic process?
Well, I wouldn't say that he has absolute contempt for the democratic process, because as far as I know, there's only been one opposition official who's been sent to jail. And when I tell you that what the president says are basically empty threats, I mean it, because as for me, I am a blogger in the Philippines with about 1.4 million followers. And I actually face a libel case filed by one of the opposition senators. That opposition senator does not speak like Duterte, but he actually sues people, sues regular citizens. Now, that would be a little unfair if you're going to say, like, well, he's not the president. But the point here is, this president comes from a different generation, and that generation is very prone to exaggerations.
Okay,
now,
but RJ,
if I were
when
to
he came to
choose,
power, RJ,
if
when
you
he
could
came to
give,
power,
if
okay, he comes from a different
Yeah.
generation. When he came to power, He said, I'm going to kill people involved in the drug trade. 27,000 people are dead, according to high estimates. The police says 6,000, right? But we can even split the difference. Say it's between 15 and 20. Thousands of people have died.
Well, it's not even that.
Thousands of people have died after he said, we're going to kill people extrajudicially. So he's threatened, and it's been done. What is the story about
Here's a very interesting fact. All right, here's the interesting thing about the number of supposed extrajudicial killings. The police gave a sum of about, say, 10,000. Let's just put it that much, and let's say it's that much. But news reports, I admit, say, quote around 27,000. I don't know anymore. But the problem is, I for myself tried to fact check media. I even tried to fact check government, and I criticize government wherever I feel the need to. Now, the point here is, when I ask those media companies, like, for example, Rappler.com, I asked them, so where did you get the numbers that you got? Well, they don't have an answer.
But Duterte doesn't question the numbers.
There was even an open challenge. Can you at least name at least 10,000 of the name of the 27,000 that you allege are killed?
RJ, your president doesn't contest the numbers. He says it was worth it.
Well, at first he tried to defend himself, but I think he felt that the media is not hearing him at all, and at the fact that his communications team are monumentally incompetent. I myself admit that the presidential communications is a bunch of incompetent fools.
Tom Villarin, no matter what the criticism, even though he's threatening politicians, he's threatened journalists, he's threatened all sorts of people, his approval rating is still in the high 70s. People still trust him. People still believe in him. What's going on there?
Well, I think that trust rating is still conjunctural, meaning it can go down any time, given now that his chance is to push for charge for change. No? And right now, the issue on the China's aggression, bullying, as well as violating our sovereign rights in our exclusive economic zone, its island building and occupation in the West Philippine Sea, all this point to a rising anger from Filipinos. And I think.
But is it a rise, Tom? Is it a rise in anger among the people, or a rise in anger among opposition politicians? Because so far there's been no evidence that the people are actually turning against their president. 2 years on, we're still in the upper 70s. That's a massive show of support.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that there's a broader groups now saying that the president did something unconstitutional. So you have the likes of Supreme Court Justice Antonio Carpio, you have the likes of Secretary Alberto Del Rosario, you have the likes of former Ombudsman Carpio Morales, and these are not the politicians that are now speaking against Duterte and want to hold him accountable through an impeachment process. So I think with this kind of people standing up, and perhaps later, more Filipinos would say, because in the past, in surveys, 2/3 of Filipinos don't want the president to tangle with the Constitution. And now, if Duterte is saying that the Constitution is just a piece of toilet paper, I think reaction against this kind of statements would boomerang against the president.
I see.
And if he wants to push the envelope more, and let's say through his brinkmanship style of governance, he would really push for charter change. I think that's when a broader opposition will develop.
I see.
And would say no to any form of charter change.
RJ, do you agree with that? That perhaps his style of leadership can
Well,
work when it comes to killing people on the streets in the drug war, but it's a little bit different when it comes to the issue of the Constitution. Might we see people being convinced that their support for Duterte is questionable?
That's a bit of a complex question, because used as a premise that it's okay to kill people on the streets.
I said
That
the
is something
issue of
that still
killing
has to
people
be
on the
proven,
streets.
because
Listen, I'm holding him to
Yeah.
his own words, right? That's it. He's saying, yes, it's justified. So I'm saying, okay, but the people still support you. So maybe for the greater good, the Filipino people believe that the drug problem is so bad that they are okay with their president maybe bending the law or being extra harsh, right? In his own words, he says extrajudicial
Okay.
killings are fine. But might it be a little bit different when it comes to the Constitution? Is Tom maybe right that when it comes to the issue of the Constitution and sovereignty, perhaps the tide will turn and his gambling style might not work?
I heard the congressman speak about a broader coalition that's forming in the opposition, and that there might be an impeachment case, and that if he pushes the envelope, there might be he might lose major support. I think that theory is cute, but it's not hinged on reality, because what we have to admit, we Filipinos, we are a developing country and with a very weak military. And China, I know, is engaging in aggressive action in South China Sea. So we are given two options: either to wage war against China or to talk to them. So if we don't have nuclear bombs, we only have even just one functioning destroyer in the Navy. Then what else do we have to? What are our other options?
So let's get the congressman to respond.
To
Tom,
talk to China.
Okay, so Tom, your president's being pragmatic and putting the interests of your nation first by not picking a fight with a more powerful nation. That's the argument from RJ. What do you think, Tom?
Well, the issue is not that we want war against China. The issue here is really upholding our constitution and the sovereign rights of Filipinos, and of course protecting our territory from China, the aggression from China. So the point here is that we are upholding the constitution, and it is this very same constitution that put President Duterte into power. So now what he's saying is he wants to do away with the constitution, because the constitution explicitly says that we have the exclusive right over our economic zone, and we have our sovereign rights over the maritime resources, the marine resources in this exclusive economic zone. So that is stipulated in the constitution. So the retort of President Duterte saying that piece of constitution is meaningless, it's full, it's like a toilet paper.
Okay.
That will have a backlash on the way how government treats its own constitution.
Okay, so listen, Tom and RJ, in the separate discussion, we'll look into the details of the issue with China and the maritime boundaries and the dispute. But I've got to move on for now. I hope you'll both come back onto the Newsmaker sometime soon. Thanks for joining us.
It's just an honor to be with you, and it was an honor that you asked me to step over that line, and I was proud to step over the line. I thought you might do that. I wasn't sure, but I was ready to do it, and I want to thank you. It's been great.
Democrats are calling Donald Trump's unprecedented visit to North Korea one of the worst days in American foreign policy. Trump became the first U.S. president in office to set foot inside North Korea and met with Kim Jong-un for about an hour. Opposition leaders in the U.S. Senate lambasted Trump for calling Kim a friend and inviting a dictator to the White House. The encounter happened as the Pentagon reportedly draws up plans to accept North Korea as a nuclear power, a stark departure from Trump's promise to end Pyongyang's weapons program. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Bruce Klinger. He headed the CIA's Korea branch and now is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And in Medford, Massachusetts, is Korean Studies professor Sung-Yoon Lee. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Sung-Yoon Lee, let me start with you. Is this the victory and the massive symbolism that Trump claims it is and thinks it is?
It's a big victory. The moment that President Trump walked into the North Korean side, he intoned, big moment, tremendous progress. He's clearly right. It was a great moment, great progress for the North Korean side. What Kim Jong-un seeks is to ensnare Trump in this never-ending process of negotiations without reaching a settlement, to drag it out as long as possible, during which time Kim continues to build the bomb. Over the past year, North Korea reportedly has built probably 10 or more bombs. So it was a great victory, not only a propaganda victory, but a strategic victory for Kim.
Bruce, victory for North Korea because they haven't had to give up anything.
Right. I would say it was historic, as Trump supporters will point out, but it was just a photo op. It didn't represent any kind of real progress. Now, during the subsequent hour-long meeting, Kim promised that he would allow his diplomats to meet with U.S. diplomats, which is what negotiations are all about. And that's the same promise that he made in Singapore in June of 2018, and then there were 6 months of no meetings. So far, we haven't had any real progress towards denuclearization. Hopefully, this might jumpstart negotiations, but I think we should have waited for reaping this fruit of diplomacy after some kind of progress.
Bruce, the Democrats are always going to politicize this, but this time around, they have a strong point, don't they? Kim is being given a legitimacy that he has not earned because he's not given up a single thing. So with that in mind, I wonder, is there a policy from Trump, or is he just winging it and rolling the dice?
Well, I think the president is winging it more than the rest of the administration is. In talking with U.S. officials, they'll lay out what the U.S. objectives are, which is the big deal, as it was called in Hanoi. Now, many people criticize a big deal as being too big, but it's really exactly what North Korea promised to do in 8 previous international agreements and what it is required to do under 11 UN resolutions. So the U.S. is pushing for Kim to commit to the UN definition of denuclearization and committing to abandoning his arsenal, not just production capabilities.
Professor Lee, is he ever likely to do that given the current overtures from Trump?
Well, we have to ask ourselves, what are we talking about here? What is the crux of the issue? Denuclearization of North Korea, right? We're not negotiating fish tariffs. We're not negotiating something about oil even. We're talking about nukes. And we know that none of the other 8 nuclear states, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus India, Pakistan, and Israel, have ever resorted to this kind of shameful nuclear diplomacy, dangling before the international community the mere possibility of denuclearization and winning tens of billions of dollars in economic reward. North Korea has perfected this game, and to posit that the mere privilege of 3 summit meetings with the U.S. president is enough to compel North Korea, that's been spending half a century in perfecting the bomb, to give it away in increments even, is, I think, a logical fallacy.
So, Bruce, we have his advisors. You have Bolton, you have Pompeo, you have the Joint Chiefs, you have the Korea envoy, Stephen Biegun. You have all of them giving their input. At the moment, who's winning? Who's most influential? Or is he just getting conflicting ideas from everybody and he's doing his own thing?
Well, in any administration, there will be conflicting advice, and it's always up to any president to determine the final course. But with President Trump, as he's said, he likes being unpredictable. So even senior officials, even cabinet members, may not always be certain what he's going to do. Back in March, the Treasury Department sanctioned 2 Chinese entities for violating UN resolutions. The Secretary of the Treasury and the National Security Advisor both said this is what is necessary, and they raved about this action. Within 24 hours, the president undercut both of them by reversing the Treasury Department's efforts to enforce U.S. law. That same weekend, he undercut his Secretary of Education, and we've seen before where he undercut his Secretary of Defense by announcing unilateral cancellation of military exercises without informing the Pentagon. So even cabinet officials aren't sure what the president may do on any given moment.
And Professor Lee, the Iranians might be looking at this and thinking, well, the only way to get respect and legitimacy is to first get the bomb, and then Trump will deal with you with some level of respect and on an equal footing. Is that the lesson?
Well, sure. And many people have been saying over the past decade, hey, look at Iraq, look at Libya. They gave away or gave up their weapons of mass destruction programs, and look what happened. There's an element of a great deal of truth in that, but it's more ominous, it's more insidious. Now, people tend to believe North Korea, by virtue of its weirdness and backwardness, is a paranoid player. They developed the bomb because they're so afraid of the mighty United States. There's an element of truth in that, but it goes way beyond that, because in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when North Korea did not have the bomb, North Korea was still able to deter the mighty United States with conventional weapons alone. The United States has never retaliated, never shot back when North Korea was killing American soldiers during the Korean War. So the point here is, yes, North Korean nukes offer the regime a tremendous deterrent, but what does North Korea seek to do? How will North Korea leverage its nuclear arsenal? Will it try to extort and bully and perhaps even prevail over South Korea one day, the superior Korean state? And in that game plan, where does an ICBM-borne nuclear warhead come in vis-a-vis the U.S. mainland?
All profound questions. Gentlemen, always good to tap into your expertise. Bruce Klingner and Sung-Yoon Lee, thanks for joining us once again on The Newsmakers.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, while negotiating peace with the US, the Taliban kills dozens in the Afghan capital. Is it time to stop talking to the militant group? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.